In this video, I want to talk about political power. It's necessary to discuss this because, first of all, we're in the world, so political power is an everyday reality. But many don't understand how political power works. Again, there's a difference between violence and power. Violence is when you use danger or the threat of harm to make others comply with you. You have an expectation that you want to manifest, and you use the threat of harm and danger, or literal harm and danger, to secure that outcome. That's violence. And violence is always expensive to the one enacting the violence, because violence also makes the perpetrator vulnerable. Even though it's the victim that receives the blows, the victim the predator, the aggressor has become vulnerable. So violence is something you can't use too often because it will destroy yourself. That means it will destroy the one enacting it. So violence is only effective to get what you want, if what you want can be secured temporarily, because violence never really secures anything for the long term. Because violence is self-destructive. But okay, so if the thing you want depends on weaker people complying, then you can use violence. Violence is not effective when you're dealing with equals or people who have a superior advantage to you. So violence by itself is the tool cowards use when they can't face reality and not willing to alter their expectations. Now, power, at the other hand, is the ability to materialize your will without much hinder from the environment. So it's also the ability to overcome and overrule resistance against the will. That is what power is. But as you understand by this explanation, most people can't see the difference between violence and power. Because in the world, violence is often used as a tool of power, because violence is powerful, but violence itself is not power. And many confuse the two. When it comes to political power, it comes down to this. You have, I'm going to take a colonial country as an example now. Let's go to Angola, colonial Angola. Colonial Angola had the local native kings or chieftains that ruled their tribes. And these tribes traded with other tribes in Africa. But now you had the Portuguese that occupied the coast of Africa. So what happened now was that the local chiefs got along with the Portuguese to secure their income. Because most trade happened by sea, as it is today also. But now the Portuguese navy ran the coast of Africa. So in order for the local kings to maintain their income, they had to get along with the Portuguese navy. And the Portuguese navy, at the other hand, needed an income. Now the income could come from Portugal itself, but Portugal also had its economic crisis from time to time. So the Portuguese navy, or the Royal Portuguese Navy, because they were led by a king then, had to be economically active within the region called Angola. So you see a dynamic over here. You have the interest of the Portuguese navy in maintaining its presence. You had the local kings that wanted to maintain their income. And you had the local population that just didn't want any fight. So you have different interests, and then they need to get along. The Portuguese navy could take down ships they didn't want near their colonies. They could do that because the locals would support them. But on the other hand, the Portuguese navy could not prevent the natives from wanting to trade or become involved in the Portuguese economy, because the Portuguese navy needed the economic activity of the locals to maintain their presence. But the Portuguese Navy didn't want the locals to understand this, because the moment the locals understood this, they would begin to demand things from the Portuguese Empire. So, both the Portuguese admirals who ran the Portuguese Navy, as well as the local kings, who also wanted to have stability in the region, they collided together in an agreement against the native population, in which the native population was discouraged from becoming economically active with the Portuguese. The natives were told only the nobles were able to deal with the Portuguese. So the local kings pretended as if they were oppressed by the Portuguese, and at the same time you had the Portuguese playing a double agent, pretends if they're the ones keeping the local kings in check. So it was a game that both the local kings as well as the Portuguese Navy plays together to keep things going. So the political power came down to keeping others distracted, so the outcome you want to maintain is not disturbed. That is what political power comes down to. Okay, let me say it one more time. Political power comes down to the following. You keep the population distracted so they won't become a threat to the outcome you want to preserve. Now, in the context of colonial Angola, at least in the beginning of colonial Angola, the interest was to advance the trade for the local kings and nobles with the aid of the Portuguese presence. And the Portuguese got in return that they were considered a maritime power. And the local kings paid tribute to the King of Portugal, so there was extra income for Portugal also. And back home in Portugal, the Lusitanians, or I should call them the Portuguese, they got the pride that they had an empire. So the incentive of the local kings was to maintain their advantage as the local elite there. They couldn't do it on their own, so they collided with the Portuguese, but that was their interest. So they had to distract the population, so the population wouldn't figure out what was going on. Now let's go to another example. Now we're going to take the captains in general of the Philippines, which was also called the Kingdom of the Philippines, which was another colonial territory, but of Spain. It worked like this. Spain wanted to trade with Asia, and the Chinese Empire was the economic bloc that I would say ruled the Asian economy. The Japanese were closed off, the Koreans also, so the Spaniards had to gain access to China. Now, when the Spaniards occupied the islands, which they later called the Philippines, you had Chinese migrants that settled there, who were merchants, and they became the local elite there. So the Chinese became the elite because trade depended on them. It were these Chinese migrants that had contact with the Chinese Empire, and that's how goods flooded into the Philippines, and from the Philippines they would be transported to the Spanish world in the Americas and in Europe. But now, you have the Chinese migrants that became the local elite. You had the Peninsulares, the Spaniards that were born on the Spanish Peninsula in Europe, that became the political elite. The Chinese migrants were the economic elite. The Peninsular Spaniards were the political elite. But then you had the cultural elite, which were the local chiefs who also learned Spanish, and many became Catholic. So they all had their interest. Now the main interest they all had in common was they wanted things to flow easily. The Chinese migrants, who now became the economic elite, they lived a life of material ease because they received much goods from China, which they now sold onto the Spaniards. So that was their income. If they had to return back to China, they would be nobodies. So they wanted to maintain their position. But for that position, they needed a stable Spanish rule. And there were sea robbers from other Asian nations that wanted to rob the Chinese merchandise that went to the Philippines. So those Chinese migrants that became the economic elite in the Philippines, they agreed with the Spanish Navy against those sea robbers. Okay, so the Spanish Navy, which was led by the Peninsulares, they had their interest in keeping good relations with China. That's why they needed to remain friends with the Chinese elite in the Philippines. And China itself could export their goods, and they could also increase their cultural influence through the Chinese migrants that live in the Philippines. We were the local elites there. So you have all these interests, and the main purpose was to keep the population distracted. So you had the local kings who pretended to have conflicts with one another, and they pretend as if things were getting out of hand, and then you had so-called the Spanish military coming in to keep things in check. Even though behind the scenes nothing was going on, the local kings, who were now Spanish vassals, they all smiled with another, together with the captain general who ran the kingdom of the Philippines on behalf of the king of Spain. But this was a trick to keep the population distracted, because eventually it was the population that had to work on the field and had to produce the products on the Philippines. Yes, you had goods coming in from China that were transferred further onto Spanish America and Spain, but the locals didn't benefit much from this trade. So they had to consider the Chinese as outsiders, so they wouldn't get too familiar with the Chinese. Because if they would have gotten too familiar with the Chinese, they would begin to demand favors from the Chinese. And if they realized the Chinese were a tiny minority in their country, they would begin to demand that the Chinese would comply with them, but they also wanted to benefit from the Chinese trade. Neither the Chinese local elite on the Philippines nor the Spanish government wanted this. Because if that would have happened, then you would have competition amongst the tribes on the Philippines, and that would hinder an effective rule. So they had to keep them distracted. And that's how they remained distracted until the Viceroyalty of New Spain ended, after which he had to reform the system a bit. Now, why did I use those two examples? Because those two examples show you clearly that political power is about distraction. And it's this distraction that preserves the privileges of the privileged group. In every case of political power, there's a group that receives privileges. Privileges are advantages you didn't have to work for or that are handed onto you on a silver plate. The reason a privileged group received these privileges is because they are the excuse for the ruling class to retain their position. For example, you had the Spanish migrants from Spain that lived in the Philippines during the colonial era, and they had privileges. Not because they contributed much to the economy of the Philippines, and not because they were participants in the government, they were not, but to justify Spanish rule, you need to have Spaniards over there. And you need to have Spaniards over there that appear to be dominant. So what did the Spanish do? You had those migrants that were deported through Mexico all the way to the Philippines. They received good housing. They received positions at seats at the government, even though they were just symbolic. They didn't decide on anything. And when it comes to the Navy, they also did jobs. Had jobs in the Navy. So when the locals over there, the Filipinos, would look around them, they would see those light-skinned or white-skinned Spaniards living in good housing, while they had to work to maintain their farms or their homes. The Spaniards had small villages that had fresh drinking water, a good sewage, a fantastic church and all of that. So they received privileges. They didn't have to work for it, but in exchange, they had to support the ruling class. And the native kings on the Philippine Islands, those Malay kings, because they were the Malayan peoples of there, they joined the ruling class, which were the Spanish colonial, which was the Spanish colonial administration. So the privileged group also serves as a distraction. The privileged group is often a minority because you can't sustain it when the privileged group is a majority, because then they will begin to compete with one another. You don't want that. Unless the majority, which is a privileged group, is divided, then you can do it. But then the privileged group itself is distracted. And then, because besides the privileged group, now it doesn't happen that often that the privileged group is a majority. Often it's just a minority, a tiny minority. Now, in case it's a tiny minority, the 90% of the population, or say 80% of the population, looks up to the privileged group. Either out of resentment, because they think, why do they always have the best jobs and all of that, or out of admiration when they want to become just like them. But it can never be like them because the system is set up that only the privileged group receives the privileges. Others are told they can get the privileges if they work hard, but they'll never really get the privileges. Only a few, like maybe 10 or 20 or 30 amongst the 80% of the 90% of the population, will eventually receive some benefits to give the illusion as if the system works as long as you work hard enough, as long as you earn it. But in fact, the system is set up as a distraction to keep the locals in a state of anxiety, while the privileged group receives ease in exchange for their allegiance. And these benefits that the privileged group receives are traps also. So the privileged group is also trapped, but they're not aware they're trapped because they have these benefits in comparison to the rest of the population. They think they are superior, or they think that they are far better off. Well, the opposite is the case. Now, before the 19th century, the privileged groups were local minorities because, just like the Romans said, divide and rule is how it went. When nationalism came up, they now had to have a privileged group across a large territory. So eventually, the middle class was developed. Now, what is the middle class? The middle class is simply the people who are not nobles, so not of royal descent. They don't belong to the elite. With elite in this case, I don't mean the pagan rulers. The pagan rulers are the elite of the world, but locally they're not the ones that own the, let me say, the shipyards and the things needed for the economy to work. But they're not the poorest of the poorest either. So they are folks that are a privileged class, but they're also an oppressed class. The middle class is an oppressed as well as a privileged class. Why? They receive privileges because they're exploited, and the privileges are there to mask they're being exploited. Okay, so that's how it goes in nation states. In nation states, you need to have a middle class eventually, so that people won't see through the deception. The working class only have work to offer. They have to just keep working. The middle class also works, but their jobs are less intense and less damaging to their health. They have more luxury, but they still need to work hard for it, but their work is different than the work of the rest of the people. And then you have the upper class, which is below the pagan rulers. And the upper class are those who manage the shipyards, the airports, the things really needed to keep the economy going, and that's their only advantage. They would lose this advantage if 80% of the population or 90% begins to compete with them. So they don't want any competition, so they keep the population divided. That's why you have the middle class. The middle class itself is divided between the left and the right. So as you see here, political power is all about keeping the masses distracted. So when you have a charismatic leader rising up and speaking exactly what people want to hear, that's another distraction. Or when you face that a government, or let me say that a government cannot make decisions effectively, don't think it's because the people in the government are incompetent. Because remember, political power is founded on distraction. When you have a government that cannot make decisions, it is because they want to distract the population. For example, it can be that I'm just going to give an example. You had the government in the Kingdom of Guatemala, which was a Spanish overseas territory. They declared independence from Spain. There was no fight, no blood was shed there was no independence fight against Spain. So the Captain General back then, together with the royal governors, they agreed to have a transition phase in which everything kept going until the transition phase was over and Guatemala was completely separate from Spain, politically and economically. You can see that after only 10 to 15 years, everything in the independent Guatemala, which is called the United States of Central America, collapsed. And that's why in Central America now you have those small republics. Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, you name it. Chiapas was taken over by the Mexican Republic. Now, what happened here? The people were distracted because the Kingdom of Guatemala was actually the most stable and prosperous country, if you want to call it that way, in the Americas at the time. The other Spanish territories were unstable and they were in chaos. The Kingdom of Guatemala was the most stable, but here's the thing. For the Kingdom of Guatemala to continue, it would remain the only Spanish overseas territories in the Caribbean. And this eventually would lead to resentment of the other ethnicities that separated from Spain. So the Spanish rulers decided to give away Guatemala because there was no fight against Spain for them to leave. But it did in a transition. And during the transition, Mexico invaded for 2 years, which was a distraction, and afterwards they left. So when the transition phase was in and things were transferred, and the Kingdom of Guatemala developed its own military and all of that, the population thought that they were now moving forward, apart from Spain. Things were about to get better. The moment the transition phase was over, the new republic fell apart. It was then that it became obvious that they had no future apart from Spain, because the main source of their wealth and their stability was affected with an extension of Spain in the Americas. Now that most of this export went to Spain, there was no purpose for the economy, because the locals, say the Guatemalan population that lived there. Now today you have Nicaraguans, Costa Ricans, but at the time they were all Guatemalans. The Guatemalans had a common purpose as a nation. Well, if you want to call it as a group. Their purpose was to provide produce for Spain. Their industry was set on it, and they also transferred Chinese goods from Asia into the Caribbean. Because from the Philippines, which was another Spanish kingdom, you also had many ships entering in with goods from China and from Asia, and Guatemala also a hub that transported them into the Caribbean and further. So you also had other ethnicities, other nationalities that wanted to trade with Spain through Guatemala. So they went to Guatemala, Spanish territory, to trade. But after Guatemala separated from Spain, there was no incentive for the economy to continue because there was no common purpose. And it couldn't serve anymore as a hub between Asia and Europe and the Caribbean because it wasn't Spanish territory anymore. So now they had to develop their own trade deals internationally. Now they had to have their own diplomacy. And there was no common purpose economically, so the social cohesion between the Guatemalans fell apart. That's why they all separated in tiny republics. And today, the people in Central America are so into their nationalism that they cannot fathom that they were ever one nation under the Spanish flag. Now what happened here was that the local, the Creole, let me say the upper class of the Kingdom of Guatemala saw that the tide was changing. And Spain realized it also. So the upper class in the Kingdom of Guatemala, together with the royals in Spain, they wanted to maintain their privilege. They wanted to maintain their position. But they couldn't let the public know what was going on. So they distracted the population with independence. And after independence, after the transition phase, when everything fell apart, the upper class remained in contact with one another, even though you now had separate countries in Central America, and they kept trading one another, also kept trading with Spain, but the locals were divided. And because there was no common purpose for the economies of the separate republics, there was stagnation. Now you had competition within the regions. And for example, Comayagua was a province in the Kingdom of Guatemala. Comayagua was later renamed the Republic of Honduras. The people that lived in Honduras after the transition phase, they were now in competition with one another, and the competition turned violent. So now you had the division amongst population turned violent, and the upper class that ran the former province of Comayagua were now the same upper class that ran the Republic of Honduras. So they kept the population distracted with the divisions while they held under the political power. And that's how Central America is still this day. So again, political power rests on distraction. That's why you have so many psyops. Now look, the video is almost a half hour. I didn't intend to make it this long. Just realize that when it comes to politics, look at what they want to distract you from. Now, for the British folks, I want to add this whole Brexit thing from the referendum that was held by Prime Minister David Cameron until the rejection of May's Brexit deal. Now in January 2019, it is all a distraction. And distraction from what? That's up to you to find out. Agree with Christ.